welcome to everyone. For those of you who haven't met me before, I am an assistant head at Charles Dickens Primary School and Nursery. My specialism is early years, and that's in my title. I've been nursery teacher for a very long time, over 20 years in various different settings, including children's centres, PVIs, and the place I've been in the most has been Charles Dickens, where we developed a 2-year-old provision. So that's a little bit about my professional background. And today we really wanted to share the first part of some maths training that we've already delivered to some PVIs and nurseries, and now we're opening up to more people who only have evenings available, and I hope you enjoy. I will put a lot of information in here, and I'm going to trundle through. I'm using a lot of images to hopefully give you lots of ideas. We will send these slides, so don't feel you have to take notes, but it'd be really nice if you do take a few so that we can share ideas at the end and maybe think about what you might like to take away from this training and what you might want to try and implement. So here we go. I'm sorry I haven't got a lamp to brighten up my face, but hopefully my slides are bright enough. So I'm going to start this slideshow. Here we go. So this first part is going to be focusing very much on teaching the association between quantity and number. And then we'll look a little at developing fluency and spotting pattern and order. And now I've tried to use a variety of images of inside and outside. Most of these images, well, all of them actually, are taken within the nursery classes at Charles Dickens. They are applicable pretty much to any space, because there are lots of ideas around games and resources that I hope are really useful. So we're going to look at some best bets that have been gleaned from the published research by the EEF. We're going to have a quick look at the guidance. I'm not going to read out those slides, but they will be sent to you for your reference. And then we're going to have a look at quite a lot of practical approaches. So this, for example, is a forest school session where there's a little bit of weaving going on. And I know that some of you do forest school, and there's so much maths in the nature that we have around us, and there's lots of pattern to be spotted around the place. So if we're looking at the statutory framework, we know that there's a massive emphasis on number and on one-to-one correspondence. Later, when you refer back to this, the highlight is around you differentiating what your curriculum is, which is in blue, and then how you deliver that, the how, which is in green, and that is your planning. So the what is your curriculum. And in development matters, we've got a lot of really useful guidance around the typical stages of the incremental stages. And when you're looking at your curriculum, you really need to be thinking about, where is my child now? What is that next stage for them? And if they're struggling with this bit, what came before? What do I need to address? Where might the gap be? And I've put the quote here from Development Matters around babies being incredibly mathematical, and for us to be nurturing that from birth, if we're lucky enough to have them around very, very early, or have contact with our parents incredibly early. So the child development training, the free government training that's out there, is also really supportive with your subject knowledge around maths and your knowledge around how children develop their mathematical thinking. And module 6 is the one you want to be looking at if you want to go more in depth. And if we look at the EEF evidence store, there are 5 approaches that they have gleaned from the research and presented to us. And we'll be looking at those first 2, teaching the association between number and quantity and promoting fluency, numbers and sequence. So the image here is around children having a look around in their space and finding objects to represent those numbers. Really lucky to have those large Numicon as well that are really helpful in arranging those objects in a really methodical way that really helps with the one-to-one correspondence. So what is that? So saying one word for one item, and hopefully those words are said in order. So let's look a little bit more at that, picking it apart. So the research is telling us that using number lines is really effective, matching, comparing quantities, and subitizing. So for some of us, it's a really familiar term. For some of us, we've heard it, but not really sure what's going on. Some of us are really fluent with the language of subitizing. All it means is that a child is able to see, or an adult is able to see an amount without needing to count it. Now, there are stages to how we do our subitizing. Obviously, seeing one object is going to be the earliest stage. Seeing 2 objects, they might need to be quite close together. If they're too far apart, some children might find that a little bit tricky. They see 1 and 1. And actually, that's a great thing to be talking about because 2 is made up of 2 1s. There is also the stage of seeing 3 objects in a really nice line that you would maybe see on a dice. And some children have been exposed to dice quite a lot in games that they may play. So they might be really good at recognizing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 6 because of using dice all the time. But when you put those groups of 4 in a random arrangement, they might not notice that it's 4. So that's what subitizing is. But it's important to see that even within subitizing, you'd be doing that in stages. You can make really predictable arrangements that are easy to spot. And then the next stage that's harder is seeing when there are 4. And usually you're noticing that there are 2 and 2, or you might notice there's a 3 and a 1. And that's a really fun thing that we're going to discuss in the second part, which I hope you all sign up to and join me for the second part. So if we're, sorry, I went a bit too quickly there. So I just skipped the dough. If we're going to be needing to count quite fluently, we need lots and lots of opportunities to count all sorts of things, or sorts of different materials. We know that some of our children are very sensory, so have some squishy things like dough to count. You could present the dough in balls, put them in nice things like shells to attract a child who may not ordinarily come to that type of activity. And here is an activity around a collection of buttons. And this is really sort of the next stage that you would present to, say, some children who are between 3 and 4, and they've already developed some fine motor skills and they've got some quite good hand-eye coordination. You could use this pipe cleaner and some buttons and carefully place those onto the pipe cleaner. Now, as you're doing that, you're slowing down the count. So often at the early stages, children are not taking one object per word that is said. They're taking a handful. You can either go to really large objects, or you can slow it down by adding a fine motor element that you're arranging things. And here they're arranging them by threading them onto a pipe cleaner. So a little idea there that I've used quite often with varied groups of children, and it's always been quite popular. So I thought I'd slip that one in to share with you. And another great way is to have pots and things like buttons that make a sound. So as you plop them in, that's when you say your number, when you hear the plop, but not randomly in between the silences. And that's a way that you can teach really accurate counting. Or you might want to arrange them on a little block or on a piece of paper, on something that takes it away from the main group. So you're taking from a larger group, but making it quite distinct that you're arranging it in a pot, in a bowl, or on a surface. So really teaching those techniques of how to arrange your objects before you count them. And it's up to us to make this all really fun, of course. And where you can do it for a reason, fantastic, but just be wary that it's not taking away from the accuracy and the mathematical element, because sometimes we can get a bit too involved in the imaginative role play and lose the mathematical element. So I've spent quite a bit of time on getting to grips with just some mathematical games that are purely mathematical, making them really, really fun because of the resource that's being used or the challenge that we provide. We might, for this one, for instance, use a timer, put a 1-minute timer on and say, right, let's see how many we managed to thread in that 1 minute. So how would you slow down the count for maybe some younger children? You might have much larger objects. So this is an example of using some really nice sensory balls and arranging them in those large Numicon. And here there's so much to talk about, because you can talk about simply what can you see and find out from the child. They might be seeing 2 empty circles. They might be more interested in seeing the 2 balls that they've got. And this will spark conversations about numbers within numbers. And here are a couple of really real life opportunities that are quite exciting for those children who really need that element of, why are we doing this? Why does this make sense to me? Well, because you want to eat some really fresh garden peas. And as you count them, you might be eating them. You might arrange them before you eat them, but you eat them when you do the check, the final check of how many there were. In September, for instance, we harvest our dried up beans, and then we'll say, okay, let's put 5 in each of our pots here so that we've each got the same amount. And here you can hear that we're doing really, really early division. I'm not going to glean that from them, but by experiencing it, it's going to make more sense to them later when we're sharing things out equally. So here they might just be doing a very accurate count, plopping them into their pot, and then they might take them across to another area where they're going to plant them out. And they've been very fair about this process. And here we've got the example of a really huge number. Gosh, how many seeds have we got in here? I don't know. There are so many, I can't even count them. But this idea of taking 5 or 10 seeds from a larger amount is a really important concept. That's my pile, that's my large amount. And over here, I've got exactly 5 or exactly 10, or however many it is. that you're being very precise about. So these are some phrases that I think you might have come across. I meant to delete one of them and didn't get round to it because I've put it in twice. So number sense, teaching association, understanding numerosity, one-to-one correspondence, the threeness of three, the how manyness, cardinality. So these words are nothing to be afraid of. Earlier today, someone said, actually, the most interesting one to me is the threeness of three, because that's really talking about how a numeral represents an amount. And it's exactly that. We don't need to use high-flown language, but it's important to feel comfortable around all of these words. Teaching association that the EEF uses is exactly that, teaching the association between the numeral and the amount. That's what numerosity is about. And that is what cardinality is. It's understanding that the last number you've said in your count gives you the total amount. One-to-one correspondence, obviously, is a very important thing to be able to do before you can understand accurate amounts. So giving one number name to each of the objects that you have. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis on that in the statutory framework when they talk about number. So I wanted to share with you a little bit around a document that I've used to support our planning, which I think is really useful because it makes sure that you don't leave anything behind. The National Centre of Excellence for Teaching Mathematics, it's quite wordy, have provided and given us at no cost these wonderful progression charts for 6 areas of mathematics. And I found them really useful to be able to organise what I expose the children to, so to organise my curriculum. And for the cardinality and counting, they specifically talk about the incremental aspects of counting. So starting with just chanting numbers, not necessarily counting, just chanting the numbers, saying number words in a sequence. And the next, you'd be tagging each object with one number word. And then, after you've really got that, you'll be talking about that last number gives me the total so far. So we know that counting on from that to carry on the count is a really tricky skill. And even saying, so how many have you got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We know that the child will often go back and need to recount because they're not quite retaining that idea that the last number has given me the total. I just need to remember that last number. We don't want to rush to a child being able to do that, but we do need to observe, are they there yet? How can I help them get there? Let's make sure they have lots of opportunities to count everything, but we don't want them to stay stuck there. We want to start using that language of the last number is your total. And then you're looking at subitizing and then numeral meanings. So you can see here that there's not that massive emphasis on the numeral earlier on because you don't want that to take over from really understanding amounts. So they've quite thoughtfully put in the numeral meanings a little bit later. Obviously, we're going to be exposed to print all over the place. We're looking at print in number plates, on signs. We're not going to be not exposing children to numerals. They're everywhere. And that's wonderful early reading when you can recognize those, but it's not mathematical necessarily, not until you start corresponding it to the amount. And then looking at conservation, the idea that my group of 5 things here is still 5, even when I spread it out. It's still 5 when I have it squished really close together. It's still 5 when I arrange it differently. If I don't take anything out and I don't put anything in, it conserves its value. It stays the same. That's why they call that conservation. So this is how we organised our cardinality and our counting for our 2-year-olds and then for our 3 to 4-year-olds. And we very specifically used this idea from the progression chart that was given to us, or that we found from the National Centre of Excellence in Teaching of Mathematics, saying number words in sequence, tagging each object with 1 word, knowing the last number gives the total, recognizing small quantities without counting. So exactly what we looked at. And then we thought, okay, so how does that look? What are we going to be doing? What kind of language do we want to use? So then we decided, okay, let's write down exactly the words that they want to be exposed to at this stage. And I'm happy to share these. If you would like, just email in and I can send you all of the planning if that's useful. And then we also want to have books that are supporting all of this. We know that developing language for our children works really well through using texts. So why not find a whole load of books that support the different strands of maths? So here are the books that support us in cardinality and counting. So the second approach is around promoting seeing pattern and fluency, and noticing and just getting really comfortable. So repeating that count sequence and matching the number word with the name. So here you can see a practitioner who's getting the children to really have a look at a puzzle and match the amount with the numeral. Now this is kind of the next stage, because she hasn't got the objects here to count. So she's actually gone to the representation stage, because these children have done loads and loads of manipulative work. They spent time on the concrete. They're now doing a little bit of representation. And then later, hopefully, they will be able to manage the abstract when they go into their schooling. But we need to make sure there are no gaps whatsoever with their concrete experience of maths, and making that fun and enjoying it, so that they are not developing misconceptions around what an amount actually is. So here our child is in the continuous provision, so that's a time when he's not being asked to do something specific by an adult. The child is making his own choices with resources that have been left around for him to make the choice of where he wants to do his play. And as you can see, he's quite naturally created a repeating pattern. Now, nobody asked him to do this. It's just the exciting magnetic resource that was there lent itself to him making an orange, blue, orange, blue, orange, blue pattern. So the adult role there is to ask, perhaps, what he might have made. You might comment. You might say, oh, that looks really interesting. Do you want to tell me about what you've done? And he might say, oh, I've made a rocket. And you might say, well, that is a really interesting looking rocket. It seems to have a pattern. And the child might say, yeah, it's got blue and it's got orange. And you might then reinforce, it is, it's a blue, orange repeated pattern. Sorry, I said that the wrong way around. It's an orange, blue repeated pattern, because he might carry that on. And you might say, oh, so what's going to come next? And you build that conversation. But this is something he's naturally done. So this might be a child who's pre-verbal, who's able to show us that he's thinking mathematically. He's seeing a pattern. He's working out that he could put things together in a mathematical way. And he's showing us that. So we need to provide those opportunities for children to show us through their actions, because they may not always be using words. They might not be at that stage. So this slide is about using our routines of the day, our structures, adding in a little bit of maths there to show the children that maths is everywhere. We need to apply maths for everything we do. It's incredibly practical. How are we going to know how many cups we need if we don't count how many people we have around our table? So by modeling, oh, let me check, how many people do we need cups for? You do the count. Next time another child is going to be the one to do the count, they might say, oh, miss, would you like to, or Linda, or whoever it might be, they're adult, they might say, would you like to have water as well? And that will change the amount of cups that they need. And that builds a conversation, and also really clear understanding of one-to-one correspondence. And in those moments of need, that's often where we really nail those skills. So here is an idea around a resource that we found to be useful to expose the children to numerals a lot. You could use these in different ways. Here it was being used to make collections of those amounts. And those collections were in these lovely bowls that are made from coconut. And the first stage might be that they put things of the same type in there. So they might categorize, oh, I'm just going to put conkers in that one. I'm just going to put little bears in this one, and I'm going to use some unifix in this one. And then at a later stage, they may realize that actually it doesn't need to be the same type. They just want to put the exact amount in there. So for two, they might put two completely different objects. It's the amount that's important, not so much which object it is. So you can see with all of these games, you can differentiate within them. Then having a few board games is a great way to reinforce the counting of steps, to reinforce the use of the die. And what I encourage people to have is to have some sort of number line around in the environment that you can refer to for those children who may not recognize a numeral and they need to go and work out what it is. Because you might be using a dice that has your numerals on it, or you might be using one that has numbers on it. They're dots on it, rather, for the children to have a go at subitizing. And here, with the 2-year-olds, I made up a quick grid as I was in there and said, oh, come on, we're going to play a game of 3 in a row. We've got bamboo slices and we've got branch slices, and we're going to see, are the branches going to win or are the bamboos going to win? Let's see which ones we can get in a row. So the children are really invested in seeing 3 in a row and working out how to do that. And before you know it, they're actually subitizing 3. Because they're not counting along, they're actually seeing it because it's in a grid formation. And here is a game that I've played quite a lot, where you have dice. And here we've got a really big one. And then you've got the numerals, and then you've got some really nice gems. These ones are flat. So what it meant was that children who had to turn it didn't matter if they rolled the same number because they were able to place those flat gems on top of somebody who'd already had a go. So they roll the dice, they recognize how many dots, or they might count them if they're not yet recognizing the formation. Then they count out that many gems, and then they find the numeral that they want to put it next to. And because we've set this up as a group, we've all helped each other to put those numerals into an order. Now you can see, you can scaffold that. You might be at the stage where you place them in order because you want to do that, because you don't want to waste too much time on that because your children are not recognizing them yet, but you want to expose them to it. It may become a really big part of it where they each have a numeral and then they need to put them in the order and they're ready for that, and it brings about discussions, and you might be talking about the one that goes before, the one that goes after, but what comes next. So you can see there's a real richness to this little game. You can even extend these things to having a little piece of paper somewhere where you might mark, oh, we found that one. You might mark off that you found the 3, you found the 3, or you found the 4. So always think about what is it that your children are getting from it in that moment, and how do you want to extend it for those individual children. So here's the same game, and put in a slightly different formation where it's facing the child rather than it being upside down to the child. Think about these things. And then doing the same sort of game, but using slightly different resources that are smaller, a bit more fiddly, but also give the opportunity to use something like Numicon, where you can put amounts together and subitize quite quickly. And then once you've exposed children to a game that you facilitate, you can then leave this out for the children to access independently, so they can have a go with their little friend, or just have a go at doing it. They might have a book area set up and a little tray with these sorts of resources for them to just have a go at on their own. And that gives you an opportunity to assess what they're able to do, what they're interested in, and how they're thinking mathematically. I find it really fascinating to see how children arrange things. So you might want to introduce a 10 frame or a 5 frame to give children the opportunity to arrange their amounts in different ways. And that really needs to be introduced and taught and shown. But what we don't do is tell them how to see the amount. So you might ask, what do you see here? And you'll have that child who says, well, I see 3 and 2. And then you'll have another child who says, well, I see blue and red. And then you'll have the child who says, well, I can see 1 red and 4 green, blue. And you may have the child who talks about the empty spaces. I can see 3 empty spaces and 2 empty spaces. And then you might have that child who's saying, I can see 5 and 5. I can see 5 empty and 5 full. And that gives you a really good idea of where the child is and how to build on their way of thinking, rather than adapting their way of thinking to your way of thinking. Remember, how they see things is not wrong. It's different to your way of seeing things. It might be the same. And it's really interesting to see how our brains are wired differently and similarly. And these 3 ideas are just ways of getting children really interested in seeing the numerals. We've all come across those children who are really disinterested in numerals, and it's a hard task to get them involved. So I've put a few ideas here of things that have attracted children that were generally not that keen on playing around with numerals. These bottom ones here, these foam ones, I really didn't think were going to be such a popular resource. They were donated by a parent who didn't want this mat anymore, and the numerals just slotted into the mat. You might recognize them, but actually they were used all the time. They were carried around the place. They were referred to a lot of the time. Here, the girl at the top is matching all of the numerals that she can find in the new environment and making collections of numerals. And here outside, a child has put all the numerals in order and then used them as stepping stones. And over here, those same foam numerals have been used to put up on a board because they got wet. And it was really fascinating to see that that made them stick. No glue is used here. It was simply just stuck with the wetness against the foam. And on the other side, these are ice cream tubs that we asked our cook to save. So we were lucky enough to be able to get loads of ice cream tubs, being a school for quite a few children. But that is something that you could collect over time. You could use smaller Tupperware. But the beauty of them being quite large is that you can make it into quite a fun, large motor activity. So these are conkers that the children had collected in the autumn, and they were throwing them into a particular numeral. So once they got them in, they'd say, oh, I got it in the 3 tub. Oh, I got it in the 4 tub. And having them in a random formation really helped us understand whether they could recognize those numerals. And then you might put them in order, but sometimes if they're in order, you can't really glean whether the child recognizes them or not, because they're able to work out by counting along. And they might sometimes do that mentally without our knowing. So it's important to arrange numerals in random formations as well, if you're trying to work out what they recognize. And here's the sign up for the second part, where we're going to look a little bit more at seeing numbers within numbers and different aspects of taking numbers apart and playing around with them, making comparisons and connections. And here are useful links that I've referred to. So we're going to send these 2 slides with the live links, and then the rest of the slides we'll send as a PDF.